The chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom bled light onto the city's elite, a galaxy of curated smiles and bespoke suits. Each champagne flute chimed like a tiny, fragile bell, a delicate sound belying the predatory currents that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. This was a world of suffocating opulence, a world Alara Vance had fought tooth and nail to re-enter, not as a disgraced name, but as a formidable force. Her architect's eye saw the room not as a space for celebration, but as a structure of power. Its load-bearing columns, the old money families, its decorative cornices, the newly rich, all held together by a fragile mortar of mutual interest. Tonight, she was to be its centerpiece. The Vanguard Award for Humanitarian Design was more than a trophy. It was a coronation. It was the culmination of a decade spent meticulously rebuilding a legacy her father had left in ruins. Her firm, Vance Designs, wasn't just creating buildings. It was erecting a firewall against the past, one award-winning, ethically sourced project at a time. The award was for her work on the Phoenix Initiative, a series of sustainable, community-focused housing projects built on blighted land. It was a name she had chosen with deliberate irony, from the ashes. And now, to present the Vanguard Award to a woman whose vision is quite literally reshaping our city's skyline. The MC's voice boomed, smooth as polished marble. Please welcome the visionary architect, Ms. Alara Vance. A wave of applause, polite yet resonant, washed over her. Alara rose from her table, her movements fluid and controlled in a gown the color of midnight. She was a study in quiet strength, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, her face a mask of composed gratitude. She nodded to her best friend, Maya, whose answering smile was a beacon of genuine warmth in the sea of performative goodwill. As Alara approached the stage, a lifetime of ghosts walked with her, the hushed whispers at school, the pitying looks from former family friends, the crushing weight of the name Vance. She reached the podium, the warmth of the spotlight a familiar, earned embrace. She placed her hands on its polished edges, her worn architect's scale a small, silver heirloom from her grandfather tucked safely in her evening bag, a talisman of order and creation. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "To the committee, to my team, to the communities who trusted us. If I may, a voice, musical and laced with steel, cut through the air." The room's energy shifted, a collective, silent intake of breath. Victoria Blackwood glided toward the stage from the wings, a vision in emerald silk, her smile as bright and cold as the diamonds at her throat. As the primary benefactor of the evening's charity, the Blackwood Foundation, her interruption was not a breach of etiquette. It was a display of ownership. She owned this room, this event, this moment. "Forgive me, Alara," Victoria said, her voice amplified by the MC's microphone, which she took with a practiced grace. "I wouldn't dream of interrupting, but our wonderful MC missed a rather crucial part of your story, one I feel adds such a poignant layer to your success tonight." Alara's hands tightened on the podium. Her composure did not break. Her face remained a placid lake, but beneath the surface, a monster stirred. She knew what was coming. Victoria turned to the audience, her expression one of admiring sincerity. "You see, what makes Ms. Vance's work with the Phoenix Initiative so compelling is that she isn't just building homes for others. She is, in a very real sense, rebuilding her own." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Many of you may be too young to remember the spectacular collapse of Vance Investments, but it was a defining financial cataclysm of its time, a lesson in ambition over ethics. The polite applause died. The champagne flutes stopped chiming. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to bend light. Alara could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, their curiosity morphing into suspicion, into judgment. The ghosts were no longer walking with her. They were clawing at her. Her father, David Vance, Victoria continued, her tone now dripping with a counterfeit sympathy, left behind a legacy of ruin for so many families. And so, to see his daughter rise from those ashes, to see her dedicate her life to laundering that tarnished name with such noble charity work, well, it's simply inspiring, isn't it? It proves that, with enough determination, any stain can be polished away. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the smile of a saint. Victoria had not raised her voice. She had not used a single overtly insulting word. She had simply taken Alara's moment of triumph and reframed it as an act of desperation, a public penance for the sins of her father. She handed the microphone back to the stunned MC and turned to Alara, her eyes glittering with victory. "Congratulations, my dear," she whispered, close enough for only Alara to hear. "You've earned this." In that moment, the opulent ballroom dissolved. The faces of the elite faded into a blur. Alara was 16 again, standing in the cold, sterile hallway of her family's now empty mansion. The auctioneer's tags fluttered on every piece of furniture, small white flags of surrender. She saw her father, David Vance, a titan of industry reduced to a hollowed-out shell, his gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance where his future used to be. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it seemed to physically shrink him. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he had whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I tried to build an empire for you. Instead, I left you a crater." That image, the ghost of her broken father, was the fuel that had powered her for a decade. It was the fire she had harnessed to forge a new name for herself. And Victoria Blackwood had just poured gasoline on it. Alara stood frozen at the podium, the Vanguard Award forgotten in her hands. She did not cry. She did not lash out. She met Victoria's triumphant gaze with a chilling stillness. The composed mask she wore did not crack. It hardened into something impenetrable. The audience saw a woman in shock, a victim of a cruel public shaming. But Maya, watching from the table, saw something else. She saw the shift, the infinitesimal narrowing of Alara's eyes, the tightening of her jaw. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the calm before a hurricane. It was the sound of a formidable, controlled rage being fully, and finally, unleashed. The weeks following the gala were a masterclass in quiet endurance. The incident became the talk of the city's philanthropic and business circles, a piece of delicious gossip served with cocktails at every subsequent event. Victoria's version of the story, painted with strokes of concern and pity for the poor, ambitious Vance girl, became the accepted narrative. Alara's phone calls to potential clients went unreturned. A promising commission for a new museum wing was suddenly indefinitely postponed. Victoria's poison was a slow-acting one, not meant to kill Alara's career in a single blow, but to gradually paralyze it, leaving it to wither from isolation. Alara's office, a minimalist loft in the city's burgeoning design district, was her sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the clean lines of architectural models and the organized chaos of blueprints. This was where she created order from entropy, where she translated abstract visions into tangible structures. The walls were adorned with framed awards and magazine features, each one a brick in the new foundation of the Vance name. But now, they seemed to mock her, artifacts of a reputation that was dissolving like sand through her fingers. "She's systematically boxing you in," Maya said, perched on the edge of Alara's expansive drafting table. Maya, a brilliant art curator with a punk rock sensibility hidden beneath her gallery owner chic, was the one person who had been with Alara through every stage of her fall and rise. I ran into Thomas Abernathy at the gallery opening last night. He said Victoria had a quiet word with him about the financial risks of partnering with a firm linked to a history of fiscal instability. He was quoting her. Alara, verbatim. Alara ran a hand over a blueprint for the Phoenix Initiative's next phase, her touch tracing the lines of a community center she had designed. She's not just attacking me. She's attacking this work. These people. Because it's your redemption, Maya said softly, and she can't stand to see you have it. The shadow of her father's fall was a constant, ambient pressure in Alara's life. David Vance had been a visionary investor, a man who saw trends before they formed. But his ambition had become a runaway train. When the market turned, his highly leveraged empire didn't just fail, it imploded, taking with it the pensions and life savings of hundreds of smaller investors. The official story was one of reckless speculation and hubris. He was never charged with a crime, but the court of public opinion had convicted him swiftly and brutally. He had died of a heart attack 2 years later, a man consumed by his own failure. Alara had spent the subsequent decade not running from his legacy, but confronting it. She poured her inheritance, what little was left, after the creditors were done, into her education. Graduating at the top of her class, she founded her firm with a clear mission to build with purpose, to create spaces that served communities, to prove that the name Vance could be synonymous with integrity, not disgrace. The Phoenix Initiative was the heart of that mission. That evening, the true inciting blow landed. It came not as a whispered rumor, but as an official email from the city's most powerful development group. Sterling Blackwood Properties, a company founded by Victoria's father and now under her absolute control. The email was brief, its corporate language a sterile veneer over a declaration of war, citing unforeseen market shifts and a strategic realignment of our portfolio. Sterling Blackwood was pulling its primary funding from the Phoenix Initiative, effective immediately. The project was dead. Alara read the email 3 times, the black and white words blurring into a gray haze. This wasn't just a project. It was the cornerstone of her life's work. It was a promise she had made to a community, and a silent vow she had made to her father's ghost. Victoria hadn't just sabotaged a building contract. She had taken a wrecking ball to the very symbol of Alara's redemption. She walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline she so desperately wanted to help shape. The lights of 1,000 buildings glittered back at her, indifferent. For a moment, the weight of it, all the public humiliation, the professional isolation, the destruction of her flagship project threatened to crush her. The ghost of her 16-year-old self, lost and helpless in a house full of auction tags, whispered in her ear, "You can't win. Her world is made of stone. Yours is made of glass." But as she stood there, another memory surfaced. Her father, in one of his last lucid conversations, had gripped her hand. "Don't ever let them define you by my mistakes. Ellie," he'd said, his voice weak but urgent. "Your grandfather was a builder. He believed you could solve any problem if you understood its structure. Find the weak points. Every fortress has them." The despair began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear focus. Victoria had made a critical error. She believed Alara was still the disgraced daughter, the girl fighting for a seat at the table. She had failed to realize that Alara was no longer interested in playing by the rules of a game rigged against her. She was an architect. She understood structure. And if Victoria Blackwood was a fortress, Alara would not waste her energy banging on the gates. She would find the flawed foundation, and she would bring the entire structure crashing down. She picked up her phone, her fingers scrolling to a number she hadn't called in years. "Julian," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier shock. "It's Alara Vance. I need your help. I'm not looking for a defense. I'm looking to go on the offensive." Alara's initial attempts to fight back were a frustrating lesson in the nature of entrenched power. She tried the conventional channels, the avenues of reason and protocol. Each one was a door politely but firmly slammed in her face. She scheduled a meeting with the City Planning Commission to appeal the sudden revocation of permits for the Phoenix Initiative, a move that had followed the funding withdrawal with suspicious speed. She walked into the sterile, airless boardroom, armed with data, community impact reports, and a passionate, well-reasoned argument. The board members listened with feigned interest, their faces impassive masks. "Ms. Vance, we appreciate your presentation," said Chairman Miller, a man whose political career was largely funded by Blackwood contributions. "However, the Commission must consider the developer's concerns about market viability. We can't approve zoning for a project that lacks secure funding." "The funding was secure until Sterling Blackwood pulled out for reasons they've refused to specify," Alara countered, her voice even. "It was a political move, not a financial one. The project is viable, it's necessary, and it has the full support of the community it's meant to serve." "Our hands are tied," another board member chimed in, avoiding her gaze. "It's a private financial matter." They were hiding behind procedure, using bureaucracy as a shield. Victoria's influence was an invisible gas in the room, odorless and deadly, suffocating any chance of a fair hearing. Alara left the meeting not with a sense of defeat, but with a chilling clarity. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to, protecting its most powerful members. Next, she approached the banks, hoping to secure alternative financing. She met with loan officers she had worked with for years, men and women who had previously praised her meticulous business plans and flawless execution. Now, they shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their smiles strained. "Alara, your portfolio is impeccable," said one senior vice president, steepling his fingers on his vast mahogany desk. "But the climate is uncertain. An investment of this scale, especially one that has been publicly abandoned by a firm like Sterling Blackwood, carries a significant reputational risk." "Reputational risk," Alara echoed, incredulous. "My firm has won a dozen awards in 5 years. We deliver on time and under budget. The only risk here is being on the wrong side of Victoria Blackwood." The banker's silence was his answer. Victoria didn't need to make threats. Her power was a form of gravity, bending the world around her. No one wanted to be caught in the orbit of her disapproval. The final door to slam was the most painful. She called a meeting with the community leaders from the district, where the Phoenix Initiative was to be built. She had spent months earning their trust, promising them not just housing, but a revitalized neighborhood. She saw the disappointment and nascent anger in their eyes. "We believed in you." "Ms. Vance," said Maria, a fiery community organizer who had been her staunchest advocate. "But now we have a massive, empty lot and a handful of broken promises. How are you different from all the other developers who have come and gone?" "I am not giving up," Alara insisted. "This is a setback, not a defeat." But even as she said the words, she could see their faith wavering. Victoria's attack was multifaceted. It wasn't just about money and permits. It was about destroying Alara's credibility, the most valuable asset she had. That night, she sat in her silent office, the city lights twinkling below, a universe away. The initial rage had cooled, solidifying into a hard, dense resolve. Maya was with her, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, Conventional warfare is a losing proposition, Maya said, handing her a glass. You're bringing architectural plans to a gunfight. She's built a fortress, Ilara said, staring into the amber liquid. Every institution, every person of influence, is a stone in its wall. Then stop trying to knock down the wall, Maya replied, her voice intense. Go under it. Find the cracks in the foundation. It was the echo of her father's last piece of advice. Find the weak points. Ilara finally understood. She couldn't fight Victoria's power with her own because, in this world, her power was negligible. She had to fight with knowledge. She had to become an expert on Victoria Blackwood and the empire she commanded. She had to stop being an architect of buildings and become an architect of revenge. She pulled out her laptop, the screen illuminating her determined face in the darkness. She opened a fresh, encrypted document. At the top, she typed 2 words, Blackwood Corporation. It was time to start drafting a new kind of blueprint. The transition from defense to offense was a seismic shift in Ilara's world. It began in the stark, modern office of Julian Croft, a lawyer whose reputation was built on representing Davids against corporate Goliaths. Julian was sharp, cynical, and utterly brilliant, with a deep-seated disdain for the casual corruption of the city's elite. So, you want to burn down the Blackwood Empire, Julian said, leaning back in his chair after Ilara had laid out the situation. He wasn't smiling. That's not a lawsuit. That's a military campaign. Are you prepared for the collateral damage? Victoria Blackwood has already leveled my most important project and is salting the earth of my professional life, Ilara replied, her voice cold. I am well past worrying about collateral damage. Julian studied her for a long moment, his gaze analytical. Good. Because Victoria plays dirty. To beat her, you can't just be smarter. You have to be more ruthless. First rule, we don't fight her on her turf. The courts and commissions are her home field. We fight her in the shadows, in the balance sheets and shareholder reports. We turn her own company into the weapon that destroys her. Their strategy took shape. The first step was intelligence. Julian connected Ilara with a private investigator, a former financial journalist named Ben Carter, who specialized in corporate espionage. Ben was unassuming and quiet, a man who could blend into the background of a shareholder meeting or a coffee shop with equal ease. Victoria Blackwood is old money, Ben explained in their first meeting, his voice a low murmur. She inherited her power. People like that often get complacent. They see the company as a birthright, not a responsibility. That's where you find the cracks. Look for vanity projects, inefficient subsidiaries, questionable executive compensation, the things a founder would never tolerate, but a successor indulges in. Ilara began her counteroffensive, a quiet, systematic assault on the periphery of Victoria's world, guided by Ben's research. She started targeting Blackwood Corporation's vulnerabilities. She discovered a struggling luxury retail subsidiary that Victoria kept afloat for sentimental reasons. A vanity project started by her mother. Ilara anonymously fed a detailed financial analysis of the subsidiary's losses to a prominent business columnist, who ran a scathing piece on the drag it was creating on Blackwood's overall profitability. The company's stock dipped by 2 points. It was a small wound, but it was the first time Victoria had bled. Next, Ilara reached out to a man whose name had been a whisper in the back of her mind for years. Arthur Pendleton. He had been her father's closest friend and business partner, a man who had vanished from their lives after the collapse, retreating into a quiet retirement in the countryside. She found him living in a modest house upstate, surrounded by books and gardens. He was older, frailer, but his eyes were still sharp. I heard what Victoria did at that gala, Arthur said, pouring them tea in his sun-drenched study. His hands, gnarled with age, were steady. She has her father's cruelty, but none of his brilliance. I need to understand what happened. Arthur, Alara pleaded. The real story. My father never talked about the details. Arthur's face clouded with a pain that was still fresh after all these years. David made mistakes. Alara, he was over-leveraged, too optimistic. But he wasn't a monster. Sterling Blackwood. He was another story entirely. He hesitated. Then seemed to make a decision. There are things you don't know. Things your father made me promise to keep secret to protect Sterling's name. Even after everything. Victoria is destroying my life based on a version of the past I don't believe is true. I need you to help me uncover the truth. Arthur looked at her, seeing the reflection of her father's determination in her eyes. He nodded slowly. Your father kept meticulous private ledgers. He was old-fashioned that way. He never trusted digital records for the important things. After he died, I put them in storage. I think it's time we open those boxes. While Arthur began digging through the past, Alara and Julian focused on the present. They identified disgruntled board members within the Blackwood Corporation, individuals who chafed under Victoria's autocratic rule. Julian made discreet overtures, planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that Victoria's personal vendettas were starting to impact the bottom line. He presented them with analysis showing how her impulsive decisions, like pulling the Phoenix Initiative funding, created market instability and invited negative press. Alara felt a grim satisfaction with each small victory. A negative article here, a few percentage points off the stock price there, a whispered conversation in a boardroom. She was no longer a passive victim. She was an active threat. Moving pieces on a board Victoria didn't even know they were playing on. She was learning the language of her enemy, the cold calculus of power and leverage. It was a dark education, but a necessary one. She was becoming the architect of a meticulous, calculated demolition. The revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in a worn leather satchel by Arthur Pendleton himself. He sat across from Alara in her sunlit office, his face etched with a solemn gravity. The satchel contained not just dusty files, but the missing chapter of her life, the truth that had been buried for over a decade. Your father was a good man, Alara, Arthur said, his voice raspy with emotion as he pushed the satchel across the table. A loyal friend. Perhaps too loyal. Alara's hands trembled as she unbuckled the straps. Inside were 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The ledgers were her father's private financial records, the pages filled with his elegant, precise script. The letters were correspondence between him and Sterling Blackwood, Victoria's father. She started with the letters. The early ones were full of the casual camaraderie of 2 powerful men at the top of their game, sharing business insights and family news. But as the dates progressed, the tone began to shift. Sterling's letters grew more desperate, hinting at cash flow problems and market headwinds. Her father's replies were reassuring, offering advice and support. Then she found the letter that changed everything. It was from Sterling, dated 6 months before the market crash. David, I'm in deeper than I ever imagined. The auditors are coming. The offshore accounts, the creative accounting. They'll find it all. I've been skimming from the corporate accounts for years to cover personal losses. It started small, but it spiraled. Victoria can never know. My legacy, my family's name. It will be destroyed. I'll go to prison. I see only one way out. Alara's breath hitched. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes wide with disbelief. He was embezzling. Arthur nodded grimly. For years, He was living far beyond his means. Even for a Blackwood, he was using shareholder money as his personal piggy bank. David discovered it during a due diligence process for a joint venture. He confronted Sterling, who confessed everything. Her eyes flew back to the pages, reading her father's reply. He didn't threaten to expose his friend. He offered to help. "Sterling, we can fix this. I will quietly inject capital from Vance Investments into the accounts to cover the shortfall before the audit. It will look like a standard intercompany loan. We can unwind it slowly over the next few years. No one ever has to know. Your name will be safe." It was an act of profound, reckless loyalty. Her father was using his own company to secretly bail out his embezzling friend, all to protect the Blackwood family name. She turned to the ledgers. There they were, a series of massive, undocumented wire transfers from Vance Investments to shell corporations controlled by Sterling Blackwood, millions of dollars, disguised, rerouted, and vanished into the Blackwood abyss. He almost pulled it off. Arthur continued, his voice barely a whisper. He had almost replaced all the money. But then the market crashed. A once-in-a-generation collapse. Vance Investments was highly leveraged when his creditors called in their loans. The money wasn't there. It was tied up covering Sterling's theft. The hole in his books was exposed, but the reason for it remained hidden. The public narrative snapped into horrifying focus. Everyone assumed David Vance had lost the money through reckless speculation. No one suspected he had given it away to save his best friend from disgrace and a prison sentence. "And Sterling?" Alara asked, her throat tight. "He took the coward's way out," Arthur said, his voice laced with an ancient bitterness. The day after Vance Investments declared bankruptcy, Sterling shot himself in his study. He left a note blaming the pressures of the market and the betrayal of his business partners. He never confessed. He let your father take the fall for everything. Alara leaned back in her chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Her father wasn't a villain. He was a martyr, crucified on the cross of his own loyalty. And Victoria. Victoria had built her entire life, her entire righteous crusade against the Vance name, on a foundation of lies. Her quest for vengeance was not just misguided. It was a tragic, perverse inversion of the truth. She was trying to destroy the daughter of the man who had sacrificed everything to save her own father. The cold rage Alara had been nursing for weeks was now joined by a profound, aching sorrow. This was no longer a simple story of revenge. It was a generational tragedy, a poisoned inheritance passed down from father to daughter, the weight of her father's sacrifice. The secret he had carried to his grave now rested on her shoulders. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" she whispered. "He made me promise," Arthur said. He wanted to protect Victoria from the truth of what her father was. He didn't want her to live with that shame, even after Sterling's betrayal. Your father's final act was one of loyalty to his friend's memory. Alara looked down at the evidence in her hands. This knowledge was a weapon, more powerful than any financial analysis or stock market manipulation. It could not only dismantle Victoria's company, but annihilate the very core of her identity. The question was no longer how to win. The question was what victory would truly mean, and what it would cost. Victoria Blackwood was not accustomed to being challenged. The minor annoyances, the negative press, the slight dip in stock value had been like gnats buzzing at the edges of her awareness. But now, the buzzing was becoming a roar. Alara Vance was not cowering. She was fighting back, and it was beginning to draw blood. When Victoria learned that several key board members were demanding an independent review of the company's underperforming assets, a direct result of Julian Croft's back-channel maneuvers, her irritation solidified into cold fury. She recognized the strategy. Someone was methodically exploiting the fissures in her authority. This was not the work of a sentimental architect. This was the work of a professional. Realizing she had underestimated her opponent, Victoria decided it was time to end the game. She launched an all-out assault. A blitzkrieg designed to utterly obliterate Alara's life. Her methods were swift, brutal, and left no fingerprints. First, she went after Alara's firm. One by one, Vance Design's remaining clients began to pull out of their contracts. A boutique hotel developer cited creative differences that hadn't existed the day before. A non-profit building, a new art center, suddenly had its funding frozen by an anonymous complaint to the state charity board. Alara's revenue streams dried up to a trickle, then stopped altogether. She was forced to lay off half her staff, talented young architects she had personally mentored. The bright, hopeful energy of her office was replaced by a funereal quiet. Next, Victoria targeted Alara personally. A reporter from a notorious gossip website began calling, asking pointed questions about Alara's history of financial instability, using language lifted directly from Victoria's gala speech. An article appeared online, subtly linking Alara's name to shady real estate deals and cutting ethical corners all lies, but crafted with enough plausibility to do immense damage. Alara's meticulously built reputation began to fray. The attacks grew more personal, more vicious. Maya's art gallery was suddenly slapped with a series of surprise code inspections, finding trivial violations that resulted in crippling fines and a temporary closure notice. It was a clear warning shot. No one in Alara's circle was safe. "She's trying to isolate you, to make you toxic," Julian said during an emergency meeting in his office. His usual cynicism was gone, replaced by a grim urgency. "This is a scorched earth campaign. She's not just trying to beat you, she's trying to erase you." The breaking point came when Alara received an eviction notice for her office loft. The building had been abruptly sold to a shell corporation. The new owners were terminating all leases. A few hours of digging by Ben Carter confirmed her suspicions. The shell corporation traced back to a subsidiary of the Blackwood Corporation. Victoria was literally taking the roof from over her head. Alara stood in the center of her nearly empty office, packing the last of her architectural models into boxes. The models for the Phoenix Initiative, the project that had started it all, sat on her desk, monuments to a future that would never be. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her chest. Her savings were dwindling. Her professional life was in ruins, and her friends were being targeted. Victoria was winning. That night, Maya found her sitting on the floor of the empty office, surrounded by boxes, staring at the city lights. "I don't know if I can do this," Alara whispered, her voice raw. "She's going to take everything." Maya sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "No, she isn't. She can take your clients, your office, your money. She can't take your mind. She can't take what you know." She tapped the side of Alara's head. "And she can't take the proof." Alara looked at the worn leather satchel containing her father's ledgers, which she now kept with her at all times. It was the one thing Victoria didn't know she had. "Julian thinks we're ready," Alara said, her voice regaining a sliver of its strength. "He's found a way to force an emergency shareholder meeting. He's been working the proxy votes for weeks. We have just enough support from the disgruntled board members and institutional investors to call for a vote of no confidence in Victoria's leadership." "Then it's time," Maya said, her voice fierce. "It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to show her who you really are." Alara looked out the window, at the towering headquarters of the Blackwood Corporation dominating the skyline. It was a fortress. Yes, but she had the key to its flawed foundation. Victoria had pushed her to the very edge, stripped her of everything she thought she needed. In doing so, She had left Alara with nothing left to lose, and only one path forward: total war. A cold, hard certainty settled over her. The final battle was at hand. The emergency shareholder meeting was convened on a Thursday, under a sky the color of bruised slate. A ferocious thunderstorm, which had been threatening the city all morning, finally broke as Alara's car pulled up to the Blackwood Tower, a sleek monolith of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the angry clouds. Rain lashed against the pavement in wind-driven sheets, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the turmoil about to be unleashed within. The boardroom was on the 50th floor, a sterile, intimidating space with a panoramic view of the storm-ravaged city. The long, polished obsidian table reflected the grim faces of the board members and major shareholders who had assembled. The air was thick with tension, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. At the head of the table, Victoria Blackwood presided, her posture impeccable in a crimson power suit. Her expression was one of bored irritation, as if this meeting were a frivolous distraction. But Alara could see the tightness around her eyes, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand that held her antique, venom-tipped fountain pen. Alara took her seat opposite Victoria, flanked by Julian and Maya. She placed a single, slim folder on the table before her. She was not here as a supplicant or a victim. She was here as a challenger, a shareholder with enough proxy power to demand a reckoning. A large digital clock on the wall counted down the seconds to the start of the meeting, each red tick echoing the frantic beat of Alara's heart. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the room in stark, momentary flashes, followed by rumbling peals of thunder that seemed to shake the tower to its foundations. "Let us begin," Victoria said, her voice cool and dismissive. "I believe Ms. Vance has requested this theatrical interruption of our business day. Let's hear what she has to say, so we can all get back to our productive lives." Julian rose. "We are here today to call for a vote of no confidence in the leadership of CEO Victoria Blackwood. Under her tenure, this company has been plagued by mismanagement, cronyism, and a focus on personal vendettas at the expense of shareholder value." He began a clinical, dispassionate presentation, projecting charts and figures onto a large screen. He detailed the millions lost by the failing luxury subsidiary, the questionable land deals that benefited Victoria's friends, the declining stock value linked directly to her impulsive and erratic business decisions. The board members shifted in their seats, their faces growing more troubled as the evidence mounted. Victoria's lawyer interjected with objections and deflections, but Julian methodically dismantled each one. Victoria herself remained silent, her mask of cold indifference beginning to crack. A faint flush crept up her neck. Then, it was Alara's turn. She did not rise. She remained seated, her calm a stark contrast to the storm raging both inside and out. "The numbers Mr. Croft has presented tell a story of corporate malfeasance," Alara began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "But they don't tell the whole story. They don't explain the motivation behind Ms. Blackwood's destructive behavior. I can—" She looked directly at Victoria, whose eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "For over a decade, Ms. Blackwood has operated under the belief that my father, David Vance, was responsible for the ruin and death of her father, Sterling Blackwood. She believes he was a corporate villain who betrayed his partner. This belief has fueled a personal vendetta that has now spilled over into her professional life, costing this company and its shareholders dearly." "This is irrelevant and slanderous," Victoria's lawyer objected. "On the contrary," Alara said, her voice hardening, "it is the entire point, because the story Victoria Blackwood has built her life upon is a lie. She opened the slim folder and slid 3 documents across the polished table: a copy of Sterling Blackwood's letter confessing to his embezzlement, a summary page from David Vance's private ledger showing the bailout transfers, and a sworn affidavit from Arthur Pendleton confirming the entire sequence of events. "My father did not ruin Sterling Blackwood," Alara stated, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "He tried to save him. Your father, Victoria, was an embezzler. He stole millions from this very company. My father discovered it and, out of a misguided sense of loyalty, used his own firm's capital to cover the theft and save his friend from prison. When the market crashed, my father's company became insolvent because his money was gone. It was patching the holes in yours. He took the fall to protect your father's legacy." A collective gasp went through the room. The board members stared, stunned, at the documents. Victoria's face had gone chalk white, her crimson suit a bloody slash against her pallor. "Lies," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Forged, desperate lies." "It's all there," Alara said, her gaze unwavering. "The proof is irrefutable. My father's only crime was loyalty. He died a disgraced man to protect the reputation of a thief. And you have spent your life trying to destroy the family of the man who sacrificed everything for yours." In that moment, everything broke. The truth hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. The foundation of her existence, her righteous anger, her lifelong mission of vengeance, her identity as the wronged daughter crumbled into dust. It wasn't just her company that was collapsing. It was her entire world. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, stark and terrible, revealing a portrait of utter devastation. The digital clock on the wall hit 0. "The floor is now open for the vote of no confidence in CEO Victoria Blackwood," Julian announced into the stunned silence. The vote was a formality. One by one, hands went up around the table. The motion passed unanimously. Victoria Blackwood, the untouchable queen of the city's corporate and social scene, had been deposed in full view of the world she once ruled. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, wide and vacant, were fixed on the documents that had shattered her life. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent, leaving a profound and unsettling quiet in its wake. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The news of Victoria's downfall and the explosive revelations about her father spread through the city's financial district like a shockwave. Headlines screamed from every news outlet: Blackwood CEO ousted in hostile takeover. Decades-old scandal rocks Vance and Blackwood families. The narrative Victoria had so carefully controlled for years was shattered, replaced by a sordid tale of embezzlement, betrayal, and a tragically misdirected vendetta. Victoria was escorted from the boardroom by security, a silent, ghost-like figure moving through the wreckage of her life. She didn't look at Alara. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was turned inward, locked on the ruins of the past. The boardroom, moments before a theater of high-stakes corporate warfare, was now strangely quiet. Discarded papers littered the obsidian table. Board members spoke in hushed, urgent tones on their phones, managing the fallout. An interim CEO was appointed, and a statement was being drafted for the press. Alara remained in her chair, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. This was victory, but it didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, consequential. She had won. But the cost had been the utter demolition of another human being, a person who, she now understood, was as much a victim of her father's lies as Alara had been. Maya came and stood behind her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Alara." "Did I?" Alara murmured, looking at the rain-streaked window. The storm had passed, and a week. Watery sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. I exposed the truth, but it feels like I just concluded a tragedy that began before I was even born. Julian Croft packed his briefcase, his face unreadable. You did what you had to do. You defended yourself. And you corrected the historical record. Justice is rarely a clean or happy affair. He paused, looking at her with a newfound respect. What you did in there took more than just intelligence. It took courage. He nodded once, a rare gesture of acknowledgement, and left to deal with the legal mechanics of the transition. Alara, Maya, and Arthur Pendleton were the last ones left in the vast, silent room. Arthur, who had been sitting quietly in the back, observing the culmination of a secret he had kept for so long, walked slowly toward the head of the table. He looked down at the chair where Victoria had sat, his expression one of profound sadness. Your father would be so proud of you, Ilara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not for the victory, but for your strength, and for finally bringing the truth to light. She lost everything, Ilara said softly. Her company, her reputation, the memory of her father. Everything. She lost a lie. Arthur corrected gently. It may take her the rest of her life to realize it. But today, you freed her from the poison she's been drinking since she was a girl. What she chooses to do with that freedom is up to her. Later that evening, Ilara stood in her now empty office loft, the final few boxes waiting by the door. The setting sun cast long, golden rays across the floorboards. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters, from former clients suddenly eager to work with her again, from members of the Blackwood board wanting to discuss the future. She ignored them all. She held her worn architect's scale in her hand, its familiar weight a comfort. She had started this journey to rebuild her family's name, to create a new legacy of integrity and purpose. Along the way, she had been forced to become a demolitions expert, tearing down a structure built on lies. The question now was, what would she build in its place? The path to revenge had ended. The path to redemption for both her family and the Blackwoods was just beginning. A month later, Ilara stood in what had been Sterling Blackwood's office. It was a cavernous room on the top floor of the tower, a museum of old-world power, dark mahogany walls, leather-bound books that had never been read, and a vast desk that looked more like an altar to commerce than a place of work. The Blackwood board, in a move of both strategic necessity and symbolic apology, had offered her the position of interim CEO to oversee the restructuring of the corporation. She had accepted. The room had been left untouched since Victoria's departure, a time capsule of a fallen dynasty. Ilara walked over to a small table by the window, where a collection of silver-framed photographs was displayed. Most were of Victoria at various ages, a smiling girl on a pony, a confident young woman at her graduation, a poised executive. But one photo, tucked away in the back, caught Ilara's eye. She picked it up. It was an old, slightly faded color photograph from a summer barbecue, taken decades ago. Two families stood laughing under a large oak tree. David Vance, young and vibrant, had his arm around Sterling Blackwood. Their wives stood beside them, and in front, two little girls held hands. A dark-haired Ilara, no older than 7, smiled shyly at the camera, while a blonde, pigtailed Victoria grinned with a missing front tooth. It was a portrait of a time before secrets and betrayals, a relic from a world where their names meant friendship, not war. A deep sense of sorrow washed over her. All the waste, all the years lost to a lie, all the pain that could have been avoided. Her victory felt less like a conquest and more like a reclamation of a shared, broken past. Her final act was not one of destruction, but of rebirth. The next day, she called a press conference in the lobby of the Blackwood Tower. The room was packed with journalists and television crews, all eager for a statement on the future of the beleaguered corporation. Alara stepped up to the podium, not as a conquering CEO, but as the architect she had always been. She looked calm, centered, her voice steady as she began to speak. For decades, the names Vance and Blackwood have been associated with a painful and destructive history. She began, a history of financial collapse, of personal tragedy, and of a bitter feud born from a series of devastating secrets. Today, that history ends. She announced that she would be permanently declining the CEO position. Instead, she had used her new controlling interest in the company to establish an entirely new structure. The assets of the Blackwood Corporation will be transferred into a new entity, she declared, her voice resonating through the silent lobby. A charitable trust dedicated to a singular mission to heal the kind of damage that defined our family's past. It will be called the Vance Blackwood Foundation. A murmur of surprise went through the crowd. This was not the corporate takeover they had expected. The foundation's profits will be used to fund two primary objectives. Alara continued. First, it will promote ethical business practices through education grants and scholarships. And second, it will provide financial relief and second chances for families and communities that have been ruined by financial disaster and corporate malfeasance. It will be a legacy of restoration, not of ruin. It was the ultimate reframing of her victory. She was not liquidating her enemy's empire for profit or glory. She was transforming it, turning a weapon of destruction into an instrument of healing. She was taking the poisoned legacies of both their fathers and using them to build something new, something that would honor the good man her father was. And, perhaps, atone for the man Sterling Blackwood had failed to be. She had broken the cycle of revenge. Her power was not in the victory itself, but in how she chose to wield it. This was the final, triumphant design in her life's most important project, building a meaningful peace on the foundations of a devastating war.